Welcome. This is Stephen Lee, and this is Life and the Living of It. Spiritual direction. Many, many years ago, I had a pastor friend of mine suggest that I go to spiritual direction. Now, this was back in the late 90s, and I knew nothing about spiritual direction. But my friend basically said, well, this person listens to the Spirit while you tell them your concerns, your troubles. She said many of her colleagues and herself went to a spiritual director. And I asked, but what do they do? She said they really listen to the Spirit, and depending on what the Spirit moves them to do, will either give advice or tell you something that they hear in what you're saying. She said you really just have to experience it. And I would keep that in the back of my mind for the next 8 years. Now, from the late 90s to the early 2000s, things got a lot worse for me. Things happened, my heart started failing, my health started getting really, really poor. I started losing my sense of peace. I had stopped going to church, I had stopped hanging out with people, I was hermiting. But basically, I just ignored God, and ignored my relationship with God. And I was miserable. And I don't know what happened, but my mind kept coming back to this conversation about a spiritual director. So like anybody, I Googled a spiritual director in the Austin area, and one of the first listings was this lady that my friend went to. Now, of course, with anything like this, I heed and hawed, but finally I made it down there. And the same person my pastor friend saw, Gene Springer, saw me. I did not know what to expect. And I think she could tell how confused and questioning I was. And at one point, she just said, well, tell me your story, and I'll listen. And we'll let the Holy Spirit do what it does. And so I began my story. Now, I had been to therapists before, and I kind of knew the routine, but Jean did something very different. When I finished talking, she just sat there. She closed her eyes, and for 2 minutes, I was just there looking at her. And then she said, well, this is what I hear. And she heard in it a lot more that I had never thought about. She asked me to go back to the times that were good for me, that I felt loved or supported, when I felt a part of the community, when I felt needed, and pointed out correctly my relationship with God at the time that led to these feelings. Now, fast forward 16 years, and I find myself in spiritual direction classes to become a certified spiritual director, so that I can do for others what Jean did for me. But you may be asking, okay, but what is a spiritual direction? I mean, how is it different from a therapist? How is it different from congregational care or a talk with a pastor? What makes it spiritual direction? Let me throw out a couple of definitions. Thomas Merton's definition of a spiritual director is someone who helps another to recognize and follow the inspiration of grace in their life. In small groups during my training, I heard that a spiritual director is a privileged witness to the spiritual unfolding of God in someone's life. And yet, I probably agree with you that these are a little vague. But I also learned that spiritual direction explores that kind of deeper relationship with the spiritual life of the person. But one of my favorite definitions is a spiritual director is like a midwife who opens their heart's home to you in hospitality and holy listening. They create a safe place for you and attend to the process, that of listening for and identifying where God's love intersects one's life. So what kind of questions might spiritual direction answer? I mean, for me, it answered questions like, where am I going in this life? Does the quality of the relationship I have with God actually change my life that much? Does the relationship with God I have actually change my relationships with others that much? I've been plateauing and I don't understand why. Things aren't changing. Or even the bigger questions, I can't see what's coming. I don't know where I stand. Now, there are a couple of assumptions that go into a spiritual direction session, a couple of guidelines too. And these differ from therapists or pastoral care or just talking with a friend. Now, first, what is the same? Well, a therapist creates a space of trust. So does a pastor. Hopefully, so does the friend that you're talking with. But spiritual direction also tries to discover what a person sees of themselves in relationship to God, how they understand how they came to this image of who they are in relation to God, how to discover God and the forms of God showing up in their life. Very different than a therapist who tries to identify problems, patterns of behavior, and provide therapies for those particular issues. Another thing spiritual directors might do is help clarify values. If I think of myself as a loving person, and love is one of my values, then the spiritual director might ask me more stories in which I failed at loving my neighbor, or myself, or my God, or clarifying what my values of love really are, or celebrating with me when the values that I place on love are achieved, are seen, are expressed. Another thing a spiritual director might do is to discern, to point out, do you realize that God was there? What you just shared with me sounds like a God moment. Now, pastoral care might do that. A therapist certainly would not. And of course, being intentional about prayer. Most spiritual directors will open with a time of silence, a time of prayer, a time of centering, a time of reflection. They might even explore what happens when we bring our relationships and our experiences of life to prayer. They may delve into what God is doing and saying now. They may go into how we can perceive God's presence. And the biggest difference I personally found between pastoral care, therapy, and spiritual direction, that silence is okay. In fact, when I was in small group spiritual direction during my training, I asked our director, what do you do when the Holy Spirit just doesn't give you anything? Here we are in silence and prayer, and you don't get anything. What is your response? What do you say? She says you go back to intentional prayer and sacred silence, which was actually quite a load off because I have been talking with people for years, and sometimes I'm praying in my mind, God, give me the words. Give me the words. Let me say something. There's a lot of times I don't get anything. And yet, silences are powerful. I learned that in small groups, that sometimes the best answer is to continue to hold someone in love and silence. Now, let me get to the things that spiritual direction is not. It is not someone judging another and saying, this is how you fall short. It is not someone condemning someone. It is not pushing a particular denomination or creed or belief system. It is not dealing directly with mental health issues. That is when a therapist should be recommended. Spiritual direction is not one person directing another person's thoughts or actions. Now, what are the benefits? I'm going to go personally here. These are the benefits I have received. I developed greater self-awareness about my values systems and how and to what extent they manifest in my life. I've gotten a better picture of what I see as a priority and what I don't. I can better identify when God is directly and indirectly moving in my life. I feel a sense of accompaniment. My spiritual director is accompanying me during this time of my life, in and with and through the Holy Spirit in prayer. I find I'm asking better questions, not only questions about God, but questions about my life. I am seeing more deeply relationships and connections. I am better able to identify miracles in other people's lives, miracles in my own life. About some decisions, I have better clarity. What am I actually wanting or desiring? And I am learning better through her example how to create a safe space and a holy place for people to grow and to heal. And I find that I can sense the presence of God more easily and more frequently. and that more opportunities for God to use me to love my neighbor happen. I also found my spiritual practices changing. Those spiritual practices that don't work for me, I've given up. And those that tap into my gifts and talents, I'm doing more of. And basically, I feel closer to God, to my neighbor, and to myself. And finally, I've become so excited about what I am finding in spiritual direction and what I am learning being trained as a spiritual director, that I see this as a lifelong ministry. To love my neighbor by creating safe spaces and holy places in which God's love intersecting their lives can be explored, and where someone's experience of God can be discussed, and that we both can learn to love our God, our neighbors, and ourselves better. And this is life and the living of it.